Do you want to know what the 3 most common pitfalls are when you're preparing your carbon footprint, GHG inventory or carbon accounts, and how to avoid them? Good, because that's what I'm going to talk about today. So first up, let's say what those 3 things are. So number 1, using the wrong emissions factors. Number 2, calculation errors. And number 3, data. Now, if you don't want to stick around for the rest of the video and you just want to jump straight into really understanding that in a bit more detail, look for the link in the description of this video and book a free call with me today. But if you do want to listen into the rest of this video, that's great. Let's get into it. So I've been preparing carbon footprints and GHG inventories for about 15 years now, and I see these 3 pitfalls really regularly. The first issue, emissions factors. Calculating carbon emissions isn't in and of itself all that complicated. What you need to do is gather activity data for each of your emission sources, so that could be kilowatt hours of electricity used, or litres of fuel consumed, or maybe tons of waste generated. And then you get the right emissions factor, multiply the 2 together, and you've got your carbon emissions. Sounds pretty straightforward. Now in the UK, we primarily use emissions factors published by the UK government. So that's great, they're nice and accessible. The challenge is there are 2 things you need to think about when selecting the right emissions factor. Firstly, there are well over 2,300 carbon dioxide equivalent emissions factors in that data set published every year. So if you're going to select it manually, you really do need to know what you're doing to make sure you get the right set. The second issue is time period. Because the emissions factors data set is updated every year by the government, you need to make sure you get the right set for your time period. And that's perhaps a little bit more tricky if, like for most people, your financial year runs across 2 calendar years. So you just need to be careful you're getting the right period. And those 2 things together, I've seen result in errors of 10, 20, 30 or more % for specific activities. So you really do need to make sure that you've got the right emissions factor when you're calculating your emissions. The second pitfall is calculation errors. Now, over the last 15 years, I've built some pretty serious spreadsheets to ingest lots of data, process it, and come out with a carbon footprint at the end. And anybody who works with spreadsheets will tell you that they can get fairly complicated fairly quickly. So you need to be super careful when you're building that spreadsheet to make sure you're processing the data accurately and applying the right emissions factor in the right way so that you get an accurate output of your carbon footprint GHG inventory. So the third pitfall, as I said, is data. Now this is nothing to do with the technical aspects of creating a carbon footprint. It's just to do with getting hold of and organising data. Now in 15 years, I've never worked with a client who wasn't overly optimistic about how long it would take them to pull together data. And it doesn't matter whether they're a multinational corporate, a bank, Russell Group University, whoever, they all have this issue. So whenever a client tells me how long they think it's going to take them to pull together the data we need, in my head, I'm always at least doubling it, tripling it, maybe even sometimes more if I think perhaps they haven't got the processes in place to get hold of that data. And the issue is that quite a bit of the data you need has never been gathered before, or if something similar has been gathered, it's not been gathered for the purpose of carbon emissions. So there's always a little bit of work to do to kind of get that data into a shape that you can actually use it. So how do you fix these issues? Well, the first 2 can be largely eliminated by using a piece of dedicated software to do all the heavy lifting of ingesting and processing the data so you can be sure that you can rely on the result. At Hut22, we partner with Carbon Delete, which is one of the most easy to use and cost-effective solutions out there. The guys are continually updating and enhancing the system so you can be absolutely sure that you can rely on the output. So the third pitfall, data, is actually a little harder to solve, but that's where 15 years in the industry comes into play. Understanding where to look for data, knowing the shape that it's likely to be in and what we're going to need to do to process it to make it ready for calculations, all means that I can help you make that data gathering process as painless as possible. So if you're about to create your first carbon footprint, or maybe you've done it once or twice and you're dreading doing it again, and you want to avoid those 3 really common pitfalls, well look, find the link in the description of the video, go ahead, book a call with me today, and I'm absolutely sure that I can make that process much less painful than it would otherwise be.